be in England. The title of this talk is actually Thinking and Writing Graphically, or it might be Writing and Thinking Graphically. Now, my dissertation project begins with a very simple question. How did early 17th century philosophers of science and their more conventionally literary peers respond in the face of their recognition that words are an unreliable medium for the communication of knowledge? Now, because one of the strategies I think they developed involved the use of sensuous and particularly visual representational forms, I think that the format of this presentation is actually wonderfully appropriate to my research. It foregrounds, that is, some of the very questions that I seek to address and historicize with specific regard to the 17th century. Now, these aren't questions I've fully resolved, but they're ones that I'm beginning to think through. And to begin with, what is the relationship between words and images? As these images hover and scroll behind me, do they represent emblematic devices to which you can more surely fasten my ideas? Do they, in the words of Francis Bacon, represent emblematic, or do they present conceits, or my intellectual conceits, in a sensible form? Or are these images merely ornamental, rhetorical embellishments that run the risk of distracting from my very words? Or do we have to think about these questions in these dichotomous terms, as an either-or? What happens when words approximate the status of images, when they become graffiti? Or what I like to refer to as forms of graphic representation, instantiations of language like the words on the screen that blur any firm distinction between words and images. And this word graphic is one that I've increasingly used to kind of think through my project, because it refers to both the visual and the verbal arts. And in doing so, it allows an opportunity to escape this kind of dichotomous thinking. Now, these images up here now, taken from George Herbert's The Temple and Ben Jonson's 1605 publication of Hymenei, represent concrete examples of graphic representation. In foregrounding or drawing attention to their status as visual texts and textual images, they become things or objects that we see as well as read. In fact, in the case of Herbert's Easter Wings, which is an image I really love, it draws attention to it, or it requires us to see it before we can even read it. In fact, we have to physically engage with the object, turn it 90 degrees before we can even begin to unpack its meaning. So why does this matter? Firstly, these visual artifacts or archival artifacts have led me to rethink a verbal and visual binary that informs the way literary scholars do their work. Now, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that we as literary scholars have a verbal bias. And to contemplate, even as we use this kind of like digital format or visual media to communicate our ideas, we still continue to suffer from a certain degree of myopia. And to reflect on how these textual artifacts that I'm reflecting on have been retransmitted in modern editions is to discover the distorting effects of that bias. It's to recognize how it limits or minimizes, if not quite erases, the graphic. And in the intellectual history I want to map out, the graphic is something I want to recuperate. But why should the graphic be recuperated? Now, my larger project is concerned with the relationship between the sciences and the arts, both verbal and visual. Now, scholars, particularly sociologists of science, have increasingly pointed to the degree of factura, the madeness at the heart of the sciences, or the even scientific facts. But we still continue to think of the sciences and literature, or empiricism and literature, as reflecting two different kind of ideas about how language works, or should work. Similarly, art historians have increasingly pointed to the way in which the observational impulse in science informed new ways of seeing. Now, that's a critical impulse I share, but I also think that we can continue to, or begin to explore, how not only the sciences and the arts thought about the imagination and the resources of the imagination, but also the possibility of language for hieroglyphic or emblematic representation, its potential to reduce intellectual conceits to sensible forms. And in this way, their endeavor is not that different from our own. Thanks.